and welcome to today's edition of The Full Scottish on Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Ruth Watson. My guest today is William Duguid, who's a writer and I like to think of as something of a thought-smith. William, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure having you here.
A pleasure being here. I'm intrigued by the word thought-smith. If maybe it's the thoughts of Mr. Smith, the man on the Ballornock omnibus. I don't know.
I was thinking about it this morning. I was thinking, how do I introduce William? Because you always strike me as being a really considered person. And I thought, it's writers are wordsmiths, so I sort of think of you as a bit of a thoughts-smith. But then that is my pretentious whimsy for the day.
I couldn't possibly comment on that.
So moving into the Ukraine update. Oh, I'm sorry. The voice in my ear is asking me to mention Azra, who was going to have been a guest today, calling us from. I'm sorry, Linda. So the guest that we were going to have today calling us from Bosnia is Azra. And but unfortunately, she's been taken unwell. Nothing too serious, but she's lost her voice, poor thing. So we wish her well and hope that she's feeling better very soon. Looking at the Ukraine update on day 704. A Russian reconnaissance and sabotage group shot dead a brother and sister in a Ukrainian village on Saturday during a cross-border incursion, local officials said. The attack in Andriivka occurred in Ukraine's Sumy region inside a 5-kilometre buffer zone along the border with Russia, an area where Kyiv had asked residents to evacuate. The victims were a 54-year-old man and a 68-year-old woman who were killed while driving in an SUV, Ukraine's Prosecutor General said. At least 3 other civilians were killed in Russian attacks in the east and south of the country, local officials said on Saturday. In Berbić in the southern Kherson region, explosives dropped from a drone killed 1 person, the governor said. 2 were killed by Russian artillery shelling in the eastern Donetsk region, Ukraine's national police said. Russian missiles struck an industrial site in the central Ukrainian city of Kremenchuk on Saturday, sparking a fire, according to the local governor, Filip Pronin. Ukraine's SBU security service said it had uncovered a corruption scheme in the purchase of arms by the country's military totaling the equivalent of about $40 million. Saturday's announcement of mass procurement fraud, confirmed by Ukraine's defense ministry, will have a huge resonance as the fight to root out corruption is a major issue as Kyiv presses its bid to secure EU membership. Ukrainian counterattacks were holding Russians back from taking full control of Avdiivka, the UK Ministry of Defence said. Russian forces had suffered heavy personnel and armoured vehicle losses, frequently caused by Ukrainian unscrewed aerial vehicle munitions, the ministry outlined in an intelligence update. The Biden administration has announced the approval of a $23 billion deal to sell F-16 warplanes to Turkey after Ankara ratified Sweden's NATO membership. Ukraine has pressed Russia to provide proof that a military plane shot down during the week had been carrying dozens of Ukrainian prisoners of war, as it claimed. The latest twist in the row over the incident came as Ukrainian officials said a Russian raid had killed 2 civilians near their border. Ukraine spy chief Kyrylo Budanov questioned on a state TV why Russia has not shown any images of the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers that Moscow claims were killed when the plane was shot down. Kyiv has confirmed a prisoner exchange was to take place that day. Vladimir Putin said Ukraine glorifies Adolf Hitler SS killing squads and vowed to eradicate Nazism as he opened a memorial marking 80 years since the end of the siege of Leningrad. Putin's claims that Ukraine is a fascist state that needs denazifying has been debunked as false by independent experts. Joe Biden will host the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz at the White House on the 9th of February to discuss aid to Ukraine. It comes as the US president had been pressing Congress to embrace a bipartisan Senate deal to pair border enforcement measures with aid for Ukraine. The US is planning to station nuclear weapons in the UK for the first time in 15 years, amid a growing threat from Russia, according to media reports. Warheads 3 times as strong as the Hiroshima bomb would be located at RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk under the proposals. I mean, William, there's a couple of things here that I wonder about. I mean, and we'll come to the nuclear weapons story later, but this claim by Putin that he still seems to be clinging to, that Ukraine is a fascist state that needs denazifying. I mean, it's. I mean, we are seeing sort of the rise of fascism. Sort of in the far right groups that are growing across Europe and in America and in Russia, but it's this fixation on. I mean, not all fascists are Nazis. Um, so why is he so fixated on Nazism, especially when there's never been any evidence that I mean, they're I mean, Ukraine didn't have any evidence of being a sort of Nazi state, nor that it's teetering towards Nazism. So why do you think this is this obsession?
Well, it's a pretext in a sense for some of his activities, that's for sure. But and I suspect he sees it as a sort of dog whistle for certain shades of opinion in the rest of the world, and so they'll appreciate that uh, that there's some justification for the invasion, etc. But you're quite right. I mean, as far as I can see, certainly not all far right groups are Nazi. That doesn't mean they're not unpleasant, but far right politics is certainly a feature of much of Eastern Europe, and indeed is catching on in other places too. So it's absolutely not a vehicle to use to promote a war, but it's part of the ongoing propaganda onslaught. Truth isn't just the first casualty of war; it's very often an ongoing casualty, and the blows keep coming.
But I mean, looking at what's happening in Palestine, for example, I mean, the looking at the misinformation and the disinformation and the dog whistles that come out when people are talking about Palestine. The latest figures show 26,422 Palestinians have been killed, 65,087 injured in Gaza since the 7th of October, with 165 killed and 290 injured in the past 24 hours. I mean, and the reason we're not seeing news about this anymore is because they've targeted and killed, the Israelis have targeted and killed all the journalists. I mean, it's in terms of the misinformation war and who holds the truth in the matter. How savvy do you think the population of the world is when looking at the news? Because sometimes what we're being told and what we're seeing are two different things.
Absolutely. The population may not be that savvy on details because they're not getting to hear details very often. However, um, I think it's been true since the very start of the current conflict that the populations of the world are very much in sympathy in general with the Palestinians in Gaza. And in that respect, they're way ahead of their governments and trying as best they can to put pressure on their governments. But the governments still hold the way of getting the word out, and it's never the entire truth. And its focus shifts because one of the other reasons, apart from the lack of journalists, that the day-to-day death toll in Gaza isn't quite so high up the charts is because we're now focusing on the Houthis and what we're doing in the Red Sea. And if we weren't focusing on that, it would be somewhere else. And in the UK, just occasionally, it will be that Jurgen Klopp isn't going to be the manager of Liverpool anymore. And those are the ways in which the news is controlled, and the focus of the public is constantly shifted. But the public is savvy enough to know the underlying truth. And the underlying truth is that they are not happy with the way this conflict is constantly dragged out and how other things seem to get in the way of either resolving it or even in the way of getting aid to the Palestinians. And the latest controversy with the UN Relief and Works Agency could be said to be part of that, coming on the heels of the very slightly underreported International Court of Justice interim result on Friday.
It was very striking, wasn't it? I mean, the all the major news stations in this country um, were were had I mean, really nothing but like 3 or 4 lines about the case for the prosecution, but then live streamed the um, the Israeli defence. I mean, it sort of doesn't really get more stark than that. I mean, in the same way that, I guess with the COVID inquiry, we sort of saw on our TV channels, we saw sort of the news coming out, the evidence sessions from England. Um, and sort of the various political players there. But then you wouldn't know really that the Scottish COVID inquiry was going on unless, I mean, the other day when Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, was giving evidence, there was a QR code you could scan. But so in the UK COVID inquiry, you're not really seeing evidence from sort of live evidence coming out of Scotland. And you sort of, I mean, so this whole thing about who controls the narrative, where do people go? I mean, obviously, other than places like Broadcasting Scotland, where do people go to get their news? I mean, Al Jazeera perhaps, but
Some have gone to Al Jazeera, but I'm sure that's not anything other than a minority pursuit either. And sad to say, Broadcasting Scotland remains a minority pursuit, but let's improve that. The answer is, and this is slightly dangerous territory, the answer is the internet, because of course that's where there are more lies than just about anywhere. But there is also the truth if you look for it. And you're relying on people to be, to use the word again, savvy enough to find the truth. Although very often people will go for that which supports their existing view. So the people that believe that this is a genocide going on in Gaza will seek out things that support that view. And the danger then is that you get misinformation from the other sort. Because what's more important than anything, and what nobody in power has an interest in people seeing, is the absolute truth, the good and bad, the fact that we're not in a world of blacks and whites, but absolutely the dreckest grey you ever saw. And there's all sorts of complexities. And it's a very difficult thing to get your head around. People are well capable of getting their head around it, but they just aren't being given the full range of truth that they can see as truth to make them come to that decision.
I mean, interesting you should say that because as I was surfing the internet the other day, I came across a really interesting news discussion program coming out of Israel, and it's always worth going to places like Haaretz and other sort of legitimate Israeli news sources to see what they are saying. And even there, the commentators were talking about the fake news that was being spread, for example, about the terrible stories about beheaded babies, and they were saying this is not true, and even pointing out that former governments have supported Hamas in the past. Israeli governments have given funding and support to Hamas, and they were saying, actually, how safe are we within our government? So, I mean, I guess there are places that people can go, but it is hard to know what's real news and what's fake news. And do you have a particularly favorite source that you go to when you're trying to see the truth of what's happening in Gaza?
Well, strangely enough, I go to the BBC and try to read between the lines a little bit. That helps. I do look at Haaretz from time to time. I look at The Guardian, although I don't entirely trust everything I see there. And yes, I look to see what's out there on Twitter. I keep calling it Twitter. I'm sorry. It's X. I'm sorry, Mr. Musk. But it's very, very difficult. And also, I suppose, what I do certainly 3 or 4 days in the week is I talk to other people in the Yes Hub. And admittedly, that's a little bubble of opinion, but I get to see that their take on things and see what they're bringing to the party. But I have great trouble in sourcing what I can absolutely believe is truth. I know what my views are based on what I think I know, but I know that I have to be prepared to shift that view if I see compelling evidence to the contrary. And everybody has to sort of go about with that sort of caution every step you take in terms of thinking about these conflicts right now.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I sometimes follow the Jewish Voice for Peace, because it is very difficult, sort of trying to hear what the Jewish community and not just the Israeli community are thinking about things. And
Yeah.
there's great concern, obviously, amongst the global sort of the global Jewish population that some terrible things are being done in their name, and they wish to be disassociated with it. This is making clear that Zionism and the Israeli government's actions are different from the wishes of the Jewish peoples. Um, so, I mean, what was very interesting was that when the ICJ ruling came out, within hours of that, the whole news cycle in this country seemed to be taken up with allegations that local UNRWA staff had took part in the October the 7th attacks. I mean, the United Nations was founded after World War II to establish a system of international laws and rules to prevent conflict and provide aid and support to countries recovering from war and disasters. I mean, there have been failures over the years, but if the United Nations didn't exist, where would we be? I mean, it's sort of the global talking shop. Um, but I mean, there've been the UK and the United States and Israel, sort of all jumped up and went, well, we've there's allegations that 7 people out of the hundreds that are employed by the UNRWA in Israel have been associated with Hamas, and therefore we will cut all funding. And some nations have come out very quickly, like Norway, and said we will continue funding because this is an absolutely appalling thing to say. All of these displaced people, or many of these displaced people in refugee camps, the food programs, the health programs, that such as they are, that is getting through to Israel, to Gaza, um, is all coming through the UNRWA. But I mean, how cynical do you think it is that basically they've just trundled the news cycle on to try and deflect from the ICJ ruling?
Well, it certainly is. It is managing to be a deflection, that's for sure. I don't know how sort of suspicious the timing actually is. It always does seem to be that as soon as something happens that might uh, affect public sympathy towards the Gazans, something else happens to turn things the other way and to focus the news cycle elsewhere. Now, it is possible that the UNRWA released this story just after the ICJ ruling in order not to bury it, but maybe this is the time to get everything out on the table, because I think that was the trigger. But it is noticeable that the ICJ comes out with an interim ruling in accordance with international law that says certain things, and it's across the range of things. It's let's get more aid into Gaza and let's have all the hostages released, and and that has the force of international law. And the UK and others just say, "Aha, we don't care about that right now. We're just going to continue to cheerlead for Israel." And then, on the other hand, you've got allegations about a vanishingly small number of aid workers who might have been involved in the Hamas atrocities on the 7th of October. And immediately there's a strong response. And amazingly, also, that strong response goes against the interests of the Gazans, because we had something that would have helped aid get into Gaza, and now the wheels are pulled off that. And that does tend to exercise the cynicism just a little bit. I would add, I don't have any particular problems in thinking that the allegations have some form of truth in them, because the UNRWA have sacked 7 of them and they're investigating another couple. Those numbers may have changed in the last few hours. So there probably is more than a grain of truth in it. And it wouldn't be the first time that people working for aid agencies had been engaged in evil acts of one sort or another. So that's fair, but it's not fair to completely disrupt the work of the UNRWA on the basis of that, because it is less than a thousandth of their entire workforce. Less than, I think it's about a 3,000th. And it does have huge, potentially ongoing impacts.
And it's a really difficult thing, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, as you say, there is this complete cynical approach from the US, from the UK, from Israel, sort of, on the back of this monumental ICJ ruling, which, reaffirms the statehood nation, and that the Palestinians are a recognized people, and that genocide, is something which is capable of being perpetrated upon them, which it's a really important ruling. Um, on the other hand, there is this separate issue, which I guess the world has to come and look at another time. Looking at the UN, because it hasn't covered itself in glory. The Dutch UN forces, the peacekeepers who basically allowed the greater forces of the Serbians to march in and carry out the terrible slaughter at Srebrenica. Um, the UN troops in Haiti that, unbeknownst to them, sort of spread. I can't remember which particular outbreak, the cholera outbreak, from I think it was the Bangladeshi troops that were there. Um, I mean, there have been a number of occasions where, as you said earlier, United Nations forces have not behaved well, and in many occasions, there's been some pretty appalling accusations. But then you are looking at, it's not just, well, the UN. It's not just, it's not a UN force. These troops are coming from different countries. So, I mean, I guess there's this wider question about how do we make the UN better, and how do we as people and, nations and troops be better. And I guess that's a separate issue to come to another time. But I mean, how important do you think the United Nations is as a
Well,
as an
there has to
entity?
be it has to be something like the United Nations. And it's never been perfect in any way, shape, or form. And even before the United Nations, it wasn't perfect. The League of Nations that preceded it made a spectacular mess of avoiding the Second World War, if that were ever possible. And there is a limitation, I suppose, to what anybody can do. But there absolutely has to be a global forum for diplomacy, even if it's imperfect. It has to be there, because without diplomacy, without talking to each other in a plenary way, you have no coordination in terms of helping the troubled areas in the world, humanitarian aid, development, and just the de-escalation of conflict becomes harder if you're not in the room talking. The UN also is behind the whole concept of international law, such as it exists in terms of treaties and resolutions. It itself, as we may find out in the weeks and months to come, is perhaps flawed in its concept and full of hypocrisies, but it's there, and it's something that can be built on if the people of goodwill are there to do so. And there just needs to be a neutral arbiter. If indeed you can ever get total neutrality, you get as close to it as you can. I think there would be chaos without the UN. What we have to do somehow is make it better, because never previously has it been so important, I think, that the nations of the world work together for the future of humanity, because we're under threat on several levels, not just from the escalation of conflict and disagreement right now, but from the climate and all that that entails. So we go with what we've got, but how we make it better is an interesting question, and answers on a postcard, please. It's very, very difficult.
And one of the things I always think is very interesting is the way in which all the nations turn up. I mean, it's one way in which you can see the importance of the United Nations, is that when there are these big meetings, all the nations turn up because everybody wants to be there. It's I was interesting to see China the other day saying that they wanted for the Palestinian people to have their own representation, sort of permanently. I mean, I know that Palestine has been recognized as a nation and that it has a seat at the table, but I think that China's suggestion goes a step further, that it be recognized as a nation. I mean, what's your views on that? Is that a particularly remarkable hypocrisy from China, given what they're doing to the Uyghurs? or is it mischief making, or do you think that it is genuinely China perhaps looking at the interests that they've got in the Middle East and Africa and recognizing that they want to be seen as global leaders through the BRICS, perhaps? I mean, what do you have a perspective
Be a wee
on
bit of all
their
of that.
motivation?
Um, every nation is hypocritical in some way or another because every nation at the end of the day looks after its own interests. Um, the question is how far a country's interests extend to working collaboratively and for the good of all, because the good of all is the good of your country too. China is going to be the big power of this century. It's pretty well there already. It's in the background in all the discussions somewhere, and it may even be pulling some of the strings. So I think in some ways, China is genuine in saying that they want full Palestinian statehood. And they're saying that as a party that at some stage might have the ability to have some influence there. But that might be a difficult issue getting there because the whole geopolitical scene at the minute is a power struggle. Um, it's easy to think to look at what China does wrong and to say this is wrong. But yeah, as I said, everybody is hypocritical. Everybody's got areas that they are wrong in, and um, I wouldn't necessarily believe that China is entirely a bad actor in world events. I think it has the capacity to do good, just as Russia might have in some circumstances, and just as the US had if we just all did it right. I may now be sounding like a naive sort of white flag waver, but I do believe that we need to work better at international collaboration and not just to react with suspicion, but to have more dialogue. More dialogue is what helps in the end.
Well, I'm all one for sitting around singing "Kumbaya" because, quite frankly, it's we need to be looking at ways of sorting the world out better than we are, as you say, with the climate emergency barreling towards us. As anybody who's looked out their windows or listened to the wind the last few days can think. And I mean, the temperatures were above zero in the Arctic yesterday, which is pretty alarmingly. So, I mean, do you think, William, that as we're looking to the century ahead, the instability in America, the talk of the Russian Federation sort of perhaps collapsing as we're seeing sort of riots and unrest in places that would never have considered rioting or displaying unrest, and perhaps China and the so I mean the BRICS is a sort of a union of nations that perhaps are in the ascendancy now. I mean, perhaps the United Nations will become more important as the old West sort of begins its decline, and we look at the rise of new powers. I mean, is that something that you sometimes chew the cud over in Destiny and the Hub?
Well, I think that we're at a very dangerous time. We're at a time, I think, where there will be big changes over the next 30 or 40 years, maybe even less than that. And I suppose the reason the United Nations remains absolutely the crucial body to be looking at this, and I do think back with sort of raised eyebrow to the League of Nations in the past, is that big changes in the world are very often the result of wars. And I do not want the current world situation to resolve itself only after a massive world conflict. And um, the doomsday clock may not have been moved on this year, but it is frighteningly close to midnight and remains at that. And we have to be very, very careful about how we tread. And I do think that the UN, if parties of goodwill are having the discussions, the UN is a way just to smooth that path. But it will be difficult. And um, really, crucially, it'll take political will amongst a generation of leaders. And that's where, right now, I'm at my most pessimistic because I do not see strong, reliable, visionary leadership in the world right now. I see actually leadership and potential leadership with the ability to cause utter chaos. And that is a huge concern. So, yeah, when I chew the cud, it's not entirely in total comfort. little bit of grit in there, I think.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, we're looking. I mean, in Westminster this week, Martin Doherty Hughes, the SNP MP, led a debate about the condition of nuclear weapons infrastructure in Scotland. And yesterday, it was reported that the United States are planning to station nuclear weapons in the well, more nuclear weapons in the UK on the mainland of sort of land-based weapons rather than the nuclear weapons that are out at sea through Trident. I mean, this nuclear proliferation. I mean, it's nuclear proliferation as a strategy for conflict resolution. I mean, it's just a bit bonkers, isn't it? But I mean, it's as you say, we're looking for leadership, but it just seems to be that we're sort of surrounded by man children at the moment, if you'll pardon the phrase. It's the people in power just seem to be the very worst of people. I mean, where are the statesmen and women? Can we sort of package Ursula von der Leyen and sort of distribute her out? Bring back Angela Merkel. I mean, or do you
Mm.
think that they're just as bad? The only reason we think of some that they get good PR is because we don't see that much of them. I mean, how
Ursula
do
von
we
der
how
Leyen
do we
has some
sort this?
detractors, to be fair.
Well,
It's
yes.
very difficult. It's I really don't know. I mean, I think the leaders have always been tending towards the saber rattling rather than peacemaking. If you look back through history, who were the true peacemakers? I would say Jimmy Carter was probably a peacemaker, although his presidency did not end very well for him. You could argue that Mikhail Gorbachev was at least somebody who wanted to move the world on in a way that was not just to do with conflict. Um, but others, it's very, very difficult. Nuclear proliferation as a means of conflict resolution is absolutely bonkers. There is always the risk of escalation. There is always the risk of error. There's always the risk of an accident. And there is the inherent destabilization of regions by some of them having the ultimate Big Bang power and others not. And there's the greater volatility because of that. And the events of the world seem to be undermining all the non-proliferation treaties that have ever been made right now, and so that is a danger. And I really don't know if, for example, the Middle Eastern war breaks out into a wider cataclysm. Is somebody going to be rash and do something that then is irreparable? Because I do think that when the first strike happens, we're way ahead, as you indicated, with the Lakenheath, um, the weapons coming there. We're way ahead of Hiroshima right now, but we're also, you know, mutual assured destruction is what it will be. And that leaves us with a world that's uninhabitable for those that remain, very likely, if it weren't becoming uninhabitable already. So we really need to be very careful. We are at a time of history that's even more dangerous, I think, than the 1930s when such weapons didn't exist. And that was bad enough. But each war contains the seeds of the next war, and that's what we're currently experiencing.
I mean, the thing is, I mean, it's. I mean, I have to sort of put my hand in the air and say I've got a vested interest in this. I was a peace camper for many years, and lived at Faslane for 2 years and skipped about the mud outside Greenham and inside Greenham on numerous occasions as well as anti-nuclear protesting. I feel very passionately about this. I've gone to prison because I feel so passionately about this, and I've been surrounded by remarkable people who were. Um, that had a huge influence on me in the way I saw the world and talking about truth and honesty. Um, and one of the things that I learned sort of over the years is that I mean these we look at these things, these huge big, well, I'm going to have this great big weapon and it's going to stop you from doing everything. But that doesn't take into account the fact that there's a whole queen of America right now that's got this religious fundamentalist right that think that there's a huge seam of conversation on Jewish Twitter. I call it Twitter too still, or X, or Zitter, or whatever you want to call it, who say that one of the reasons why the American right wing Christian fundamentalists are supporting the war, Israel's slaughter in Gaza, is because there's this sort of the rapture depends upon the slaughter of the Jewish people, and 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 that, and then you look at what's happening with the UK and America bombing the Houthis, but actually the Houthis are bampots as well. There's a huge seam of bampottery there with this religious fundamentalism, which says, that says actually, this is fulfilling a prophecy, and they're going to receive religious blessings even if they die with it. So you've got the side of things, which is, you can't use nuclear weapons against bampot ideologies, um, or deeply held, flawed religious philosophies. But then the other thing is that actually it's the small bombs that you. I mean, it's how does the UK respond, for example, if you end up with somebody who carries a small nuclear device into this country? And I mean, it's not the big bombs we need to worry about in many ways. It's the little bombs, and the more this technology is out there, the more that you've got a chance that something like that's going to. So how do we protect ourselves against just this sort of like this insanity of people with weapons that they should never have their hands on?
We have to find a way of countering the insanity with sanity of our own. Religious views taken to the extreme have always been an issue, but it's particularly at the moment when it has potentially maximum danger. Um, all we can do individually is to get involved with discussions where we are, not just try and get through our own lives, but actually be part of the collective that actually is sane about this and doesn't want either the planet incinerated or the small device that goes off. And to think about what would happen if it did, because if something like that did happen, it could be utterly catastrophic because of the chain reaction it would set off in the reaction. But we've got to try and think about how do we deal with the bad things that happen without making things even worse. And collectively, it means we have to get out in the streets and protest at the end of the day, as has been happening much more than we have seen for a while, both with climate change and with Gaza. But we need to be protesting about other things as well. And we need to be making sure that governments are listening to us and trying to do things in the right way. But it is difficult because there's rarely uh, an acceptable alternative to the current government. So, we just vote in the same buggers again, or with different faces, but the same attitudes. And the underlying issue is that we live in an unequal planet with vested interests that actually don't mind all that much if there's a whole bunch of conflict, because they know how to turn that to their advantage. And there are many, many more of us who don't feel that way, but none of us individually has the power. We only have the power collectively, but all we can do is our best, because they've always got another trick up their sleeves. Does that sound terribly, terribly cynical? I suppose it does, but that is the way of the world at the moment.
I think anybody who sees the money that comes into the UK and elsewhere from arms sales could not think that that was cynical, but perhaps an observation. I mean, do you think that there's the one potential glimmer of hope that might come out of this whole sequence of madness and cruelty is that the argument in an independent Scotland would be nuclear free. Um, that the naysayers who say, "Oh, but we've got to have weapons of mass destruction on our soil, or the Americans won't love us anymore." Um, do you think that perhaps if the nuclear weapons are in the south of England, then Scotland can say, "Well, hey guys, you don't need us. You've got your own. Now we're off." Does that add to the nuclear free argument for Scotland, and sort of plug some of Douglas Ross's worst excesses?
Well, only if it results in nuclear weapons on a multilateral basis being reduced. Just moving them about, yeah, it gets them away from our population centre, and it fulfills our desire not to have them here. But we have all sorts of big questions to answer as an independent Scotland. It's not a reason for not becoming independent, don't get me wrong. It's part of being grown up in the world. But how do we defend ourselves? How do we sit with NATO as it exists, which actually is a highly expansionary thing right now. And what does that mean in terms of nuclear? Are we willing to be within NATO and to be a voice for nuclear de-escalation? Of course, the vast majority of countries within NATO are not holders of nuclear weapons, but they shelter under the nuclear umbrella. And if we are a collaborative defensive organization, then we should be thinking about how best we defend ourselves, and are nuclear weapons necessarily helping to defend us, or are they effectively painting a target on our respective backs? So I would hope for an independent Scotland to be a strong voice in talking about a new way of doing things in the world, that works on collaboration and tries to make the world an easier place to live in. I'd like us to do that in terms of the weapons that we've got and the defensive alliances we have. I'd like us to do it in terms of the climate. I just want us to be a good global citizen as an equal. And that is what that entails. That's what being grown up in the international world is.
I mean, looking at the issue of Scotland and its defence. I mean, Lord Mountbatten was a former naval commander, was a huge opponent of nuclear weapons. He wrote, there's actually a letter in the Imperial War Museum that he wrote when nuclear defence was being proposed, saying that he thought that it was wrong on a number of levels. One of them being that if all that money went into nuclear defence, it wasn't going to go into the regular defence, regular ships, regular armed forces, and in many ways he's been proved right. Of course, after his assassination, he was. So the nuclear weapons came to the shores. So there's a number of theories going around about the convenience or otherwise of that event. But I mean, looking at conscription, I mean, there's now suggestions that the UK could be at war with Russia within 20 years and that it will need to move to conscription to build up its armed forces. And we've had Sweden and Norway telling their populations to prepare for war. Now, obviously, they're sort of the closer side, or they're closer to Russia and its machinations. But it just seems like Vladimir Putin has sort of like shifted this whole narrative back 30 years. It's very odd. It sort of like feels like there's sort of like revisiting time all over again. But how do we, as an independent nation, how do we in Scotland view, do you think, the current conversations about conscription? Do you think that people would be more likely to accept conscription for a UK that has got Rishi Sunak in charge? Or do you think that perhaps it's a question that we need to think about in a grown up way for what we look like as an independent nation and what kind of armed forces we want to have? It is a kind of wider conversation to be had, surely.
There could be a case for, in an independent Scotland, national service of one sort or another. And that could be not necessarily in the military sense, but for example, perhaps in the humanitarian sense and doing good about the world. That's a conversation we can have. And I think it's one in which people might be quite happy to engage. I certainly think that we should promote the idea that as individuals and collectively, we should be doing good of some sort. Conscription as currently envisaged, well, is it envisaged? Because the UK government has said, well, not conscription. We're ruling out a move towards actual conscription at this point, although we could be at the start of a long discussion on that, I suppose, with what Sir Patrick Sanders and others have said this week. But I think the idea that we've got reservists, I don't think that is having as much traction or will have as much traction in Scotland as in other places, because I wouldn't just accept that we'll be at war with Russia in the next 20 years. I think there's a lot of cards to play before then, and we should be playing those cards first. So I'm kind of ambivalent, as you can tell. I do think that the idea of some form of national service actually probably isn't that bad an idea, but I don't think it involves shooting people or blowing things up.
And I think that's the big difference, isn't it? It's. I mean, I've had conversations with my youngsters about this, and they've all said that actually they don't have a problem with the idea of doing some form of national service. They lived in Asia for a number of years where that was quite common. Like, Singapore has national service, and you know, they don't have an issue so much with the idea of doing something which gives them skills, helps them contribute to their country, if need be, prepares them to defend their country. You know, sort of the idea of sort of helping with mountain rescue, or building things, or sort of helping patrol our seas to keep them safer, perhaps rescue some of these poor souls that are out in dinghies. You know, that side of things they were up for, but the idea of being part of a UK force where they would be sent out in an expeditionary and expansionist that's going to invade somebody else's land and bomb somebody who's hungry, they were just like, there's no way. So I mean, and it's interesting when you've got a UK government that is just stripping back the regiments, stripping back the funding for everything, having to bring in basically mercenaries from former Commonwealth countries because there's not enough people from the UK joining the armed forces. I mean, do you put the only way that I can see this happening would be, like, from Rishi Sunak's point of view, would be if it was a privatized Group 4 thing that his father-in-law had some kind of business interests in. You kind of can't help looking at these things and thinking how the Tories make money out of it. But I mean, how do you think this turns into the conversation about the status and standing of the armed forces in the United Kingdom as they currently are? Because there's not the UK is not the defensive power that it once was, or the aggressive power it once was.
No, it's a kind of smoke and mirrors organisation. So with the UK that gets together with the US and bombing Houthis, and it's on the coattails to an extent. And of course, the new nuclear weapons will be US weapons, etc., etc. I think there should be a discussion about what the army, what the services, the military wing of the country is for. And it should not be expansionary. It should not be trying to build a bigger footprint in the world in terms of being the power. It should be in making the world better. There are so ways in which the world needs to be made better, and I think that our armed forces should be part of that. And I am thinking just about the idealistic things that I just said. The humanitarian side of things, both at home and abroad, solving the problems that are part of society right now, not by using force, but by using just force of numbers to bring people to solving those problems. I think that would be a worthwhile thing. I do not see that conversation happening in the UK right now, because in order for that to happen, you would have to be reading about it in the press, and would have to be on everybody's lips. And it isn't. Instead, you've got the sort of very black and white sort of things that and indeed the vested interests behind what goes on in the UK, what gets into everybody's head. So yeah, it's not going to happen, but I think that's what should happen.
I mean, when you look at other nations across, like, normal nations in Europe, they seem to have armed forces that don't go off bombing other people and shooting other people in other countries. You spend a lot of time in the Destiny Hub in the middle of Perth, sort of talking to people who come just in off the street, and talking to your colleagues who are sort of yes activists, and talking about the Scottish Constitution and the future of an independent Scotland. What kind of conversations do you have about the kind of armed forces an independent Scotland would have, and how we move from this kind of expansionist, sort of conflict-laden model that the UK's always had, to conflict prevention, and what kind of armed forces do you think an independent Scotland, what would that look like?
Well, we don't look at it very much in terms of the armed forces, although I suspect the conversation would go very much along the lines that I just discussed. But what we do want is for Scotland's footprint in the world to be one which is a good voice for conflict resolution. We want to be part of the world that's invested in dialogue and diplomacy, that keeps open channels of communication, something that the current Scottish Government has done and has been castigated for, to be fair. But nevertheless, channels of communication are always important. About addressing the structural inequalities in the world, and indeed in the country itself. That's a big shift in the way of thinking from the UK, and we see an independent Scotland as having that. But overwhelmingly, we want to bring up a generation of leaders with proper political will to make things different and better, and with the vision to do so. I would just say, a fairly active dialogue about whether our current crop of top politicians are of that stamp. And I won't go too far into that, but I think what we would want in an independent Scotland is to bring on a generation of leaders that's much, much better at that than we currently see.
Well, that's food for thought, I am sure. I mean, we're interesting listening to you sort of talking about this kind of global collaboration, and it's and what an independent Scotland might look like in terms of resilience. I mean, this is going to become perhaps more salient as new Brexit rules come into force, and we're going to be looking at even emptier shelves in our supermarkets across the country. I mean, do you think that people are going to start realizing the full impact of the UK-wide vote to leave the EU? I mean, obviously Scotland voted Remain overwhelmingly. Northern Ireland voted Remain overwhelmingly. They got what they wanted in terms of a better deal that kind of helps them stay within the EU. What do you see coming in the next few weeks as the UK finally is pretty much forced into implementing these rules that they sort of the leaving the single market
rules,
meant?
Yeah, it's the rules on importing plant and animal products, and it comes, doesn't it, in two phases. The first is from Wednesday, when you need the paperwork in place, and there might be a slightly light touch approach to that at the start, but you're going to have done the background work. And then from April, we're talking in terms of physical checks, and all of that slows things down. You may have noticed in the supermarket, or I can't believe I'm talking to Ruth Watson about this. She knows fine what we've seen. That maybe the produce isn't quite as fresh as it once was because it's taking longer to get here. That will be exacerbated considerably, and animal products will be part of that too, particularly when we get to physical checks. And that will be a big change. There is a question mark about whether whether it will be worth the candle for some importers even to bother. And that's what worries me. The prospect potentially of actual shortages when we have done so much to destabilize our own food production sector over the last couple of years. I suppose there's another way of looking at it, in that they have been subject to export problems of this sort for really the last, well, you'll know, but I guess it's about 2 years, possibly more. And maybe it's a leveling of the playing field for them, which might be interesting, but it doesn't do any good in the short term. As to what people think about the full effects of Brexit, because they've been introduced very slowly, it's like the classic boiling a frog in a pot situation. Each new level of badness is kind of accepted as just a small addition to what's already been there. So I think the overall feeling of people, from the polling I've seen, is that they don't like Brexit, and they like it a lot less than they did back in, say, 2020, and certainly than 2016. I would venture to suggest we're now at the stage where in the UK population, 60% or so, stripping out don't knows, aren't keen at all on Brexit. The problem is that there is no firm view as to what the answer is, because you can rejoin the EU, but there's not a majority for that. You can try and do better with the EU without entering the single market, but there's a slightly lesser percentage for that. That would be the Labour Party way of doing things. or you could try and get back into the single market where there's actually, I think it's only about 10 or 11% are interested in just doing that. And so, how do you move forward? Um, for me, I think it's only with independence that we have a chance of moving forward, but we have to take the people with us, because even the independence movement is not absolutely agreed on what the best way forward is.
It is very interesting, isn't it? The prospect of shelves being even emptier. I mean, some of my local supermarkets, they have pictures of food rather. I mean, it's very North Korean. You know, there's pictures of food rather than actual food in the shelves, and every food and drink person that I speak to is feeling very much under the cosh in terms of the just the added expense of everything, and the issue. I was speaking to somebody the other day who said that they had to fill out a different form for each type of tomato, not just for tomatoes, but for each type of tomato. You know, so for these imports coming in, it certainly is a concern among many. And the Scottish Government has got a food resilience unit that it has set up. Um, I mean, do you find? I mean, you live in Perthshire, which is a very sort of a huge amount of Scotland's food and drink is produced and grown sort of within about 50-mile radius of where you live. Do you get any sort of idea from the people that you're talking to about the granular level, how they feel about Brexit and what they would like to see, and the changes that they would like to see, and what conversations do you have with them about what an independent Scotland would look like back in Europe?
Well, as I say, there is some disagreement about whether we go down the full EU route, which would increasingly take a long time. The further away we get from being in the EU, the harder it's going to be to get there. So not everybody is in favour of full EU membership. There are some, of course, who fly the EFTA flag. I would go no further than to say that I think it should be for the people to decide, but we should, at the very least, early on, get as good access to the single market as we can manage. And if that involves adopting all the EU ways of doing things again, then we'll be quite comfortable with that. And I think there would be broad agreement on that. And there are various ways in which that might be done, including, I guess, potentially associate membership of the EU in the early stage, pending a referendum for rejoining. Certainly, there are some people who are against the EU on political grounds, and some of the idea of the EU as a power bloc is not necessarily seen as a good thing in the world, largely because of some of the statements that have been made by Ursula von der Leyen and others, for example, about Gaza. I think that's probably a short-sighted view, because you have to take the bigger picture. And the most important thing for me about the EU is international trade, and the cooperation that entails is in itself something that makes for a healthy political organism, and we should absolutely be part of that. And pretty well everybody would, I think, agree with that.
Well, it's interesting there because I mean the whole thing about EFTA is trying to persuade people that we should leave one union where we don't have a democratic voice, to join another one where there's no democratic voice, which is a bit of a hard sell. And also, it takes much longer to join EFTA, whereas if you join the EU, you get the sort of the benefits of membership before you fully joined. So there's a whole other conversation to be had there. It's not exactly apples and oranges for pears. Well, that is it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I would just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. And so to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We are still a couple of £1,000 short of our £10,000 target. And although the pressure has been eased, we still need to raise that £2,000 to pay our bills imminently. And the cost of living crisis is hitting our studios hard. And then we can focus on securing the future of independent broadcasting in Scotland by growing our subscriber base through regular funding. Thank you so much to William Duguid, my guest this evening, and we hope that Azra Berbić feels better soon. Thank you so much, William. It's been a joy as ever. My name's Ruth Watson. Goodbye, and thank you for watching.